Hi, my name is Emmett Bodovic and I'm from Discovered Lights of Peeling Back History. Thank you so much for coming along today and listening to this presentation on Canterbury's earliest prisons, Lawmen and Convicts. For the last 18 months or so I've been doing a bit of work for the owners of the jailhouse accommodation, which is the old Eddington prison. So 2006 that changed to being a hostel and backpackers. So the owners sort of wanted me to do, and I have been doing information panels just so that nosy locals and tourists can sort of learn a bit about the men behind the build, about the build, and the people that over the time were at the prison as well. So before we start though, I will give you a wee break around a quarter of an hour, because otherwise it's just me for half an hour, and I'm sure that you'll need to maybe have a new cup of tea, whatever you need to do. And also too, I just need to keep in mind that there is some Maori names that I may get wrong. I mean no disrespect, I'm not a fluent Maori speaker, so I do have those names in print so you can see them, and if I do mispronounce, I do apologise to anyone. I don't mean any offence by that as well. So I'm just going to have a wee chat covering those three things first. So I guess the first place when we think about the law in Canterbury is probably the late 1830s in Akaroa. That really was the first place in South Island with European occupation, thanks to the whalers and the sealers as well. But even though we did have law enforcement here, British law enforcement, they were very underpaid and very kind of undermanned. You think about it, the first cops had to police the whole of the South Island, not including the Cook Strait. So you can imagine that was just near impossible. So what actually happened was, with 1840 arriving as well, was that the French interest in us increased, and not only with the whalers and sealers, but also with the arrival of the Convicts de Paris in August 1840. We had French and German settlers, and the French Navy took a big interest. And I think they were quite concerned about how undermanned Canterbury was. So the French Navy actually stepped in and they built our first lockup in Akaroa, in the French, what they refer to as the French end of Akaroa. And they were really our first magistrates. The biggest problems that Canterbury were facing back then was smuggling. The biggest no-no was bringing alcohol from ships onto the shore. That was one of the biggest problems that the French tried to keep a bit of a handle on. And another thing too was even rapes and kidnapping. So a lot of the Ngāi Tahu really had a rough time. People being kidnapped and made into work into the workforce of the whalers. So that's what the French really took care of it as well. The English also built a lockup in the English end, but by the mid 1850s they both had crumbled. Now around that time too, we had the old Maori Wars up in the North Island. They were concerned the hostilities would come down into Canterbury, and so what they did was the French Navy built this interesting looking building, which is called the Lockup, and that was initially built to house hostile Maori. Never ever used for that. We never had that issue down here. So once those two original lockups collapsed, that was our Akaroa lockup, and I'm sure quite a few sailors and drunks and people in debt got to stay in there and had probably less than a pleasant visit there as well. Now, unbelievably, 1858 Akaroa got its first courthouse, and the last court session in Akaroa was in 1979. So it's absolutely incredible. So as you all well know, by 1850 we had our Canterbury Association ships arrive, December the 16th, Charlotte Jane and Randolph. Didn't take us very long to realise we needed a lockup in Littleton. And I think it was the crew of, was it the Cressy? The entire crew got arrested from the Cressy. So I think even before we built a building, these sailors and other criminals were kept on the side of the hill and were just trusted to sit there. And then they built an A-frame, those simple little A-frame huts that you see in all the old photos that our settlers also stayed in. They built one as a lockup as well. So one of our very first cops was a gentleman called Edward William Seeger. I'm going to talk about him a bit later, and he really is Canterbury's lawman. He was absolutely incredible, and I'll tell you a bit about him later. But he arrived on the Cornwall, which was the Canterbury Association's 18th ship, and he started very low in the ranks. He was just a normal cop, but he loved practical jokes, so he liked to do that. He had a great sense of humour, apparently. So I'm not too sure whether he got a feeling or he had overheard the prisoners in this A-frame house, but he got a feeling or heard whispers about an escape. So that night, what he did was he tied a rope. So I'm not too sure how it worked, but he tied a rope between the A-frame and the police barracks. And that night, the prisoners kicked the floorboards out, lifted up this A-frame and trotted down the hill, but the rope sort of guided them down towards the police barracks where they were waiting. And that perfectly illustrated that Canterbury needed another lockup that was a bit more sturdy. So along came Charles Crawford. He's a pre-Adamite. Pre-Adamite, of course, is those settlers that come in before the first 4 ships. He built a 3-celled clay structure. Soon after that, we had a 2-story stone building built by William Cheney, who again, they were on the first, I believe on the first 4 ships, can't remember which one. But by 1860, we had the Littleton jail that most of us have seen in the books, and things like that, but I'll touch on that a bit later as well. So by 1852, we definitely needed, actually before I go into that, let me tell you about the Blue Cap gang who actually committed the first robbery in Canterbury. Their names was George Langdons, Joseph Price and Joseph Davis. One drowned down in Otago and 2 were deported to Australia for 15 years for robbery. But they committed the first robbery in Canterbury in June in 1846 at Purell with the Greenwood brothers. Now, 2 other real big names that were victims of that robbery were William Burlings from Burlings Flat and also William Preble. So they were Prebleton, sorry. The Prebles actually arrived in New Zealand on the Aurora with William Deans and the Gibbies. So again, quite a big nuclear Canterbury family, sort of all dragged into that drama as well. So that was our very first robbery, the Blue Cap gang. And so of course I'm sure the French took interest in that, being 1846, but again they were arrested down in Otago and faced trial down there as well. So by 1852, Christchurch had got to the stage too where we needed a lockup, and that was designed by Isaac Luck, the future brother-in-law of Benjamin Woodford Mountford, who I'll speak about later as well. So that was his brother-in-law. He married Susanna, and he designed the wee first lockup, and he was so proud of it that he had a ball. He had a wee dance and celebration in that lockup, so he was very proud of this as well. So by 52 we had a wee lockup and police barracks there in Marketplace. Marketplace, of course, being Victoria Square. And then soon after that, I'll just change the picture so you actually can see that we, right in the corner there is the wee police barracks as well. And of course 1860 onwards. So the Littleton jail got bigger and bigger over time, and it was demolished in 1922 as well. By 1863, our prison system was really struggling, and one of the persons that was really concerned at that time was Edward William Seeger. So he began as a simple cop. He actually single-handedly arrested the sheep rustler James Mackenzie in 1855. I'm sure you've heard about the Mackenzie country, Mackenzie Basin, and how he stole, or supposedly stole, 1,000 sheep from George Rhodes and the Levels. Apparently it was Seeger who actually arrested him and made a bit of a name for himself there. And he became the second warden of Littleton jail in 1862. So he was straight into writing letters. There were women, men locked up together. Not only that, there were the mentally ill. There was no mental health system. So even if debt, and people in debt. So there was people who were hardened criminals in with people that just owed money, women, mentally disabled. So Seeger, he really saw a problem, and he hit the papers big time and said we need to change everything that we did. So by 1863, what actually happened was the Canterbury Provincial Council chose a site for the Eddington jail. Eddington sort of had a bit of a life as it had always belonged to the Provincial Council, and it was to serve Christ Canterbury, so it was the perfect place for a prison. 6 acres was put aside for that prison, and also too, thanks to a donation by the Twiggers family, we had land for Sunnyside, and that all happened at the same time, and both of these institutions began as timber barracks. So it wasn't very exciting, that we don't have what we no longer have the Sunnyside Asylum as well, but they both began as timber barracks. And then 1817 we had the women wing of Eddington Prison. Now I probably have actually got a picture of that. If you just bear with me, there we go. So this is actually one of the earliest Canterbury examples of concrete that was used. And unfortunately, when the army took over Addington Prison, they knocked down the woman's wing, and this is all that's left. It's the sad example that we got here is all we've got left. And then what actually happened was Seeger left Littleton, and he took the woman and he took the mentally ill. The women were placed at Addington, and then the mentally ill went down to Sunnyside. And they were all upgraded in the 1870s, all by Benjamin Mountford. So absolutely amazing career, and quite a timeline too. Also, to help with that, this onslaught of convicts in New Zealand and Canterbury, was also to the Hereford. Now you remember before the earthquakes, we had that beautiful police. We had the tall 15-story police building. Now that's been, when that building was imploded in 2015. That was 152 years of policing history just on that site alone. So in 1863, again, a very simple little 3-celled timber structure, probably very similar to what Littleton had. 3 cells seemed to be the lot in those days. That was upgraded in 1873. So again, Addington, that time Addington was getting their mail wing. Now it's what we've got today. Let me show you. So what we've got today was built in 1874. So this is what is remaining at the prison. So you can imagine around the 1870s, the Hereford we lock up became a bigger stone structure. And then in 1973, we got that 15-story building that was earthquake damaged, and that's what we lost. So 152 years of policing just so they can move to Lichfield Street to the precinct with St John's and all that as well. But such a timeline, 1860s, 1870s, that stuff really, really took off as well. Let's go back to Seeger. I've sort of talked about him, haven't I? So again, he was the very first superintendent of Sunnyside. Let me go back to Seeger. I'm not very good with props, as you can see, because I do go off on a tangent and I do sort of, but bear with me. So here we got Seeger, and he really is the lawman of Canterbury, and the inmates he referred to as his children. And even though we look back on his era in mental health care and prison reform, it's a little bit barbaric, but I would hate to imagine what it was like even before him. So he did try to, bring the more modernised treatment in, and he became the first superintendent of Sunnyside as well. Brought in, therapy, online therapy, and sort of, encouraged them to sing. He even ran a newspaper. So he tried to get the inmates to sort of have a reason to get up in the morning, basically like that. And unfortunately, like most of his career, he was steamrolled. And by the 1880s, him and his wife were asked to retire, and he sort of ended up being a volunteer. And in his last few years, he worked as an usher in the court system. So he helped people in the court who were going to court. He worked as an usher. So again, very sad for such a history as this as well. So let's talk about Mountford. Now, whereabouts is Mountford? He's next. There we go. So Benjamin Mountford, famed architect in Canterbury. We lost a lot of his buildings in the earthquake. I read a wonderful story about an architect who was working, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, and I'm shameful about that, but I wasn't thinking about talking about this, but I had to tell you. He was an architect that just passed away just recently, and he was working in the provincial chambers when the earthquake hit, and his whole side of his building collapsed, and as he walked out, he said, I was sprinkled with Mountford dust, and that just touched my heart. Because we did lose a lot of Mountford, but we do have a lot left, and the Addington prison was the very last job he did for the provincial council, and he'd been working for them since they formed. I mean, he designed the chambers in 1855, so for quite a few years he had been doing all the provincial council buildings as well as private churches and things like that. Now, what I picked up and what I read about later was that I think there was really a bit of a clash of time frames. He was the Honourable Thomas Peacock. He was the public secretary, and he wanted Mountford off the job. He made it very difficult. William Ralston, who was the superintendent at the time, defended him and said, no, it's Mountford, blah, blah, blah. But the biggest embarrassment for Mountford, because the prison was taking so long to be built, was they brought in another architect, Thomas Kane, and I'm sure that was an embarrassment, and Mountford had to hand over his drawings. And I think very much that he decided that I'm not going to do anything more for the provincial council. And by 1873 too, the cathedral had fallen into his lap. He had tried for years to get into that project, and finally 1873, around the time he was drawing up those plans for the male wing of Addington, I think his heart was somewhere else. So I think the Addington prison dragged out, and the ultimate embarrassment was Thomas Kane coming in and overtaking that too. And funny enough, we only had one more year of provincial government, and I think the only real job that Thomas Kane got for that was the time ball station, which has beautifully just been restored and reopened. Right guys, that's quarter of an hour, so have a good break, and I'll see you back here with the next half of my speech. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. I hope you're enjoying your cup of tea or whatever you guys got up to during your break. So welcome back. So we sort of covered the early prisons and the early lawmen and incidences that happened. So I thought this would be a great time to bring up actually our first lawyer. He was our Canterbury Association lawyer, and his name was Christopher Edward Dampier. So he actually arrived here on the 9th of November 1850, and apparently he walked off with just bags and bags of paperwork. So the Canterbury Association sent him over to just, get those legal things sorted out before the Jane arrived, the other associationships. And what actually happened was, now you may know the name Dampier from Dampier Bay. And the reason why we got that is because when the Canterbury Association Chief Surveyor, Captain Joseph Thomas, he had a wee house built for him round where those big oil tanks are sitting, which is Dampier Bay. And when Godley arrived in April 1850, they didn't see eye to eye. Godley totally froze all the association work because of the debt that Thomas was racking up. And Godley arrived as chief agent, which had been promised to Thomas. So you can imagine he left Canterbury under a very, very dark cloud, and Dampier got his house. And that's how we came to have Dampier Bay. So the very first magistrate that worked in Littleton was Godley. So Godley actually heard our very first court cases, and Dampier was right there doing his bit in that courtroom as well. And then once he he had an office in Littleton as well. So once the association business sort of settled down and stuff like that, he began to do land sales and stock sales as a lawyer. And then he actually moved his family out to North Canterbury. And get this, he died 21 days to the day that he arrived. So he was already in his 50s when he came, and 21 days to the day that he arrived, the 9th of November, he passed away in North Canterbury. And that was Dampier, and how we got that name as well. We've also had 7 hangings in Canterbury too, which I know it surprised me. And a lot of people don't realise that we had the 7 hangings. So I thought that I would just talk to you about the first and the last. So the first hanging happened in 1868, and that was a gentleman called John Densley Swales. Now him and his partner had a general business right next door to Mrs. Pope's. Isn't that fantastic? 1868, and there's Mrs. Pope's. She actually heard the drama that night. So right next door to Mrs. Pope's, a marketplace on Colombo Street, which is Victoria Square. A fire started, and I'll tell you what, you did not want a fire in Christchurch in the 1860s. Most of the stuff was timber, and there was Swales found out in the street with his top hat and his insurance books and everything he needed, watching his business burn. Meanwhile, everyone's running around in a panic. Rebecca Money, she ran a hotel down the road. She came rushing out, and she noticed that his whiskers were burnt on one half of his face. And she said, "Mr. Swales, your house is burning." And he goes, "Yes, indeed it is." And of course, everyone was asking where his business partner was. And 5 in the morning, he was found at the Duke of Wellington and drinking, and he was arrested. So it was definitely no secret that those two didn't get along. What was interesting about that week in our history was it was the week of the big, huge flood. So what actually happened was our Waimak flooded. It sent a surge up the Avon, up the Selwyn. So of course we had a big barrel of water come in. It killed livestock, it took out fences, ripped away the banks, and the marketplace was underwater, and it damaged quite a few businesses along as well as the Swales business. So they also thought that he may have done the arson for insurance reasons. Another big event that week was the one visit from Lord Littleton. So he arrived too, I think the day after that big storm, and so he got to see all that as well. And but he'd only spent a couple of days here, and then he left. But he got to see Littleton, which is wonderful. And he had the Littleton Tunnel too, had just opened, and he managed to go through the tunnel. For 3 weeks it was open as well, so that was wonderful. So it was Lord George Littleton as well. So our last hanging, so Swales was found guilty, and he was hung at Littleton Jail. The last hanging to happen, and not only in Canterbury but South Island, was a gentleman called Frederick William Eggers, and believe it or not, 1918. So just 100 years ago we had our last hanging, and he actually robbed a bankroll on the west coast. So 3 gentlemen had gone to the bank to take out payrolls for their workers, and he made a mess on the road, so they had to stop. And 2 of those 3 men were killed during his robbery, and he fled to Christchurch, and that's where he was arrested and went to trial, and he was the last man to be hung here in Canterbury and the South Island. So there's some terrible stories around, a lot of murders and the other hangings as well. Fascinating. And even though those hangings happened at Littleton, I've put those stories up at Addington, because as I said to Grant, who owns the prison, I said, you are the last voice box for these old prisons. So we thought the hangings had their place here in the story of Addington as well. So I'm going to finish up talking to you through 2 convict situations here. This is where you've got to forgive me if I say it wrong, okay? So what we've got here is Tawhiri and Tohu. So these were 2 cousins that were regarded as the prophets of the Parihaka movement. So this was Taranaki. So what was happening was these 2 gentlemen did start off as aggressives against the government and European occupation up in North Island, and but they actually met a Christian missionary and sort of got their Christian faith, but they continued to protest non-aggressively, passively, and they sort of became prophets because of how they were handling things. Very intelligent, could speak English, and they would go to the government and sit down and try and talk things through. Meanwhile, though, they were doing rallies. They would attack survey camps, pull out pegs, and make life a bit miserable for the European settlers. No violence, just unpleasant. And eventually, it became a movement. So, and what alarmed the Europeans is that hundreds of Maori were coming to Taranaki to live at this par with these 2 prophets. And it alarmed the Europeans. So what they did in 1881, they stormed this village and arrested a lot of Maori. And these 2 guys, they came out in all their Maori outfit and their whole the rapaki mat, everything. They walked out and they met the army in all their gear, very proud, head up, and eventually they ended up at Addington Prison of all places. And the gentleman that met them, so here you see the 2 cousins are here, and William Ralston at that time, or William Ralston, you shouldn't pronounce the E, he was superintendent when the Addington prison was open. In 1881, he was the Minister of Native Affairs, so he actually met these 2 Maori guys in Wellington and accompanied them on the boat down to Christchurch. And Te Whiti in particular said, I had no idea whether I was going down to Christchurch to be killed or to be liberated. And they weren't down in Christchurch very, very long. They actually were taken on a bit of a tour to try and be persuaded about how wonderful European occupation was and what the European brought to New Zealand, and neither of them were very convinced at all as well. They were eventually released in 1883. Neither of them got a fair trial. None of them got their day in court. They actually reckon they moved them round to keep the Supreme Court from sniffing out the story, because that was really, they didn't need to be arrested for what they were doing as well. And they actually finally, I think they settled in Nelson for a while, but they did end up both in the Taranaki again. But any of their talks, their values were outlawed, but they still try, even to the end of their days, they always spoke and always welcomed anybody into their homes and things like that. So 2 amazing gentlemen as well. Now, the very last convict I want to talk to you about is Wayne David Berry. He is really the only Canterbury associate of the Mr. Asia Syndicate. So he was he's a what I like to call a likable trustee. So he was just the most likable guy, non-violent, didn't even drink, didn't even smoke, never did drugs. Big sportsman. He could have represented Canterbury and even New Zealand in cricket and I think it was rugby as well. And but he just couldn't. He just liked the easy dollar and he couldn't say no to that sort of thing. So even after he 27 years he spent in prison out of 54, I think it was. Michelle, forgive me if I got those dates wrong. So 27 years he was in prison on and off, and 5 of those times was at Addington. And he is quoted to have said Addington was the pits. He apparently didn't like Addington very much, but he did time all around the country. And he wrote memoirs towards the end of his life. He actually died of a heart failure or heart attack in Christchurch Men's in 2004. And he was collecting up his memoirs. And for the first time, we've got a clue of there was a big robbery up in Auckland, and Wayne. No one's ever done time for that. No one's ever really known about that. Whoops. There he is. Sorry, guys. I'm not very good with props, like I said. And he hinted that he was involved in that robbery up in Auckland, and at that time that was the biggest robbery that ever happened in New Zealand. He never did the insurance jobs or the safe blowing or anything like that. He said you do not beep in your own backyard. Okay, still a wonderful character. I would love to have met him and stuff. So he did pull some of the biggest jobs, but he is known as the only Christchurch connection to the Mr. Asia Syndicate, which brought marijuana and heroin into New Zealand, $3 million worth. And the drugs. Even though he never took the drugs, that was something he really did regret, because it did keep him away from his family and his kids, and you know, it was friends meant a lot to him as well. So that's basically my talk. I hope it's been interesting and you've learnt heaps. Thank you so much for coming along today, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be here in person. My health is a bit unpredictable, so I really wanted to make sure that I could do this talk today, and this was the best way of doing that. So I hope you've had a wonderful time. Have a lovely chat. Enjoy your school photos that's been assembled, and hopefully catch up with you guys very, very soon. See ya.